one, bumper. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Islam in Focus, the show in which we seek to bring clarity to difficult and often controversial topics with the help of academics, scholars and activists. We aim to bring you the Islamic perspective on the topic at hand based upon the authentic sources of Islam, the Quran, the Sunnah, the consensus of the scholars and Qiyas. And I'm your guest tonight, Mustafa Al-Mansour. This episode focuses on the feminist ideology and Islam. The author G.D. Anderson stated that feminism is not that which makes women stronger, as they are already strong. Rather, feminism is about changing the way in which the world perceives the strength of women. The emergence of Islam revived the status of women across the world, elevating them to positions of honor and dignity. As a result, Islamic history is scattered with examples of brave, intelligent, and business-savvy and pious women. However, our current times have left women subordinate to the whims of male-dominated society, the worth measured by the level of their beauty or their ability to sell products when dressed in a certain attire. This perception of women is assisted with discriminatory, misogynistic, and usurious behavior from women, traits that not only seem common, but upon further examination have become celebrated. So what are the solutions? Could feminism be a credible means to address the plight of women? Has the feminist movement found a way to address ill treatment towards women, or is it merely addressing the symptoms of the problem? How about Islamic ideals of women's role in society? Do they fit in with the modern context, or do they also need to be re-examined and re-evaluated? Are women's rights being understood in the modern Muslim community? What is the solution to achieving women's rights? Islam, feminism, what other ideas are there, and what are the compatibility between them all? For this very interesting topic, we have in the studio with us Sister Zara Faris and Iqbal, Nasim and Catherine Heseltine. Zara Faris is a graduate in Arabic and Islamic Studies from SOAS University and is a researcher and speaker for the Muslim Debate Initiative. Iqbal Nasim, who will join us a little later, is a manager from the National Zakat Foundation, which utilizes Zakat and voluntary donations from the UK to address and help Muslim women across the UK suffering from domestic violence and other such issues. And Sister Catherine Heseltine is a teacher and also a board member of the well-known Muslim Public Affairs Committee UK. We will move to the first question straight to Catherine. Catherine, in the 21st century, where do you feel society has fallen when it comes to the treatment of women, and what are the defining problems which encourage the ill treatment of women?
I think if anyone thinks that women don't suffer oppression in the 21st century, then they're blind. You could look at the statistics on domestic violence, the statistics on rape. You could look at, globally the problem of women's literacy rates, women's access to education, I think is a key factor. And again, that leads to women's lack of empowerment economically, discrimination. There is a whole list of problems.
And Zara, feminism, we mentioned feminism earlier in the introduction. In a nutshell, what is feminism and what is its importance in our current times?
Okay, well, I think this is one of the hardest questions about feminism, because I think to this day even feminists have struggled to agree upon a definition. Okay. But in terms of a very sort of descriptive understanding of what feminism is, there are many different types. So there's communist feminism, liberal feminism, socialist feminism, Islamic feminism.
Okay.
And the common thread perhaps throughout all of them is the idea of a patriarchy.
Yep.
So the idea that women have been oppressed at the hands of men throughout the history,
yep.
And they continue to be so according to feminists. And so the feminist sort of movement, in the various forms that it takes, seeks to challenge what they perceive to be as this male oppression.
Yep.
So that's kind of the essence of what the feminist movement is about for feminists.
But is it only addressing male oppression, or is it also looking at in terms of how women present themselves and maintain their own image? Or
Well, to some degree, but they would put that down to sort of male control and male influence, preventing them from making their own choices and being their own sort of individuals and defining their own identities and their own lifestyles, as they say. And the only sort of hurdle they see to that is men and the culture created by men. And so whichever angle you look at it from, for feminists it is male domination of women. So.
okay. And in terms of like major or most influential attitudes or ideas within feminism, sub-branches of feminism that are, you think, most influential in the UK?
Well, in the UK, I think one of the more fundamental and the widespread and easily accessible forms of feminism, particularly for non-Muslims, is secular feminism or liberal feminism, because these forms of feminism very much borrow the language that many people can identify with without having to have a gender agenda in a way. So concepts like equality, freedom, empowerment, liberation, these are words which the vast majority of non-Muslims will kind of feel these are good things. And so this is perhaps one of the most, I think, accessible forms of feminism, liberal feminism or secular feminism. But it certainly obviously isn't one that, as Muslims, we necessarily subscribe to.
Well, let's go into this in terms of our Muslim attitude towards women's issues. Catherine, in terms of historical attitude towards women, pre-Islamic era, and how that developed post-Islam,
we can see that Islam was something revolutionary that brought justice to women, as it did to other oppressed groups. Women in the pre-Islamic era weren't treated as people. They were treated as possessions, inherited as mere objects. And, the epitome of that is what we hear of in the Quran, that baby girls were buried alive simply because their fathers did not want daughters. So Islam put a stop to all of that. It gave women their rights as people, as beings before God. Women had the right to inheritance through Islam over 1,000 years before any woman in the West got that right. They had rights within marriage, rights to divorce, their economic rights, their right to education. All their rights were safeguarded and given to them by Islam. And it's interesting to look at that in terms of this definition of feminism, because to me, feminism is about women's rights, and as a Muslim, I believe in women's rights. Now, I know people will bring all kinds of definitions, but again, these words of empowerment, as a Muslim woman, I believe that Islam empowers me. Equality, it doesn't mean that everyone is treated exactly the same. It means they have that equal value before God, and that their rights are equally safeguarded. So those, to me, are all words that I can subscribe to.
Okay, and you mentioned Islamic feminism. Do you want to just give a little bit about what is Islamic feminism?
Islamic feminism is not too different from other forms of feminism. I think the only difference is that it seeks to, well, as they describe themselves, they seek to reinterpret a lot of Islamic primary sources like the Hadith, because they claim that this scholarship has been dominated by men, which is actually completely false, because throughout the history of time, through all the biographical dictionaries of the scholars, there are thousands and thousands of female scholars. Even recently, Sheikh Akram Nadawi, he wrote a book which documents over 8,000 female scholars, and that's only in one Islamic science, that's only in the science of Hadith. And so when Islamic feminists claim that Muslim scholarship has been dominated by men, it kind of does the job of patriarchy in airbrushing them out of history completely.
Although how many prominent Muslim women scholars do we have today? how many Muslim women scholars are invited on Islam Channel. We do have a problem today. Yes, our history is great. We've got to live up to that history, and we've got to put those role models up.
It is true that they've tapered now, but so have male scholars. Actually, the decline in female scholars is reciprocal with the decline in male scholars. And why is that? It's because back when there was a burgeoning and a flourishing of scholarship amongst men and women, it was a knowledge that was shared in the family. So the fathers would teach the daughters would teach their sons, the daughters and wives would teach the whole of society. There are some accounts of Muslim scholars who had scores of women waiting out, women and men, not just women, but men too, waiting outside their homes to be taught. And yes, there is a decline now, but it's not just with the women. And I think that this is a problem that sort of comes about with feminism, which is, okay, we acknowledge there are serious problems that are going on in our community with women. However, there is a wider problem as well. For example, I mean, look at how the whole Arab Spring started. It was Muhammad Bouazizi, a man who was so frustrated, one of hundreds of thousands, frustrated with the levels of unemployment, the corruption, the tyrannical rule in his country, that he set himself on fire. We don't call that, you know, a men's rights issue. But for some reason, then when a woman experiences problems, suddenly we make it a gender issue, when it's not that. It's the fact that justice is simply not being done, and justice doesn't have a gender.
Catherine, I think the issue of whether or not there's equal representation, is it necessarily what equality is about in terms of numbers? If you have 10 men scholars, we need 10 women scholars?
No, we're not going to go for a tokenistic approach, but I do think we can't deny that there's a problem in our community that we're not nurturing Muslim women to become great scholars today in the way that, you know, Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, was a great teacher, you know, a great source of the knowledge that we have of Islam today.
But just as much as we're not encouraging Muslim women to become great wrestlers, maybe, you know, or maybe a lot of men are going down that field. They want to keep fit and go to the gym and do weightlifting. We don't say, oh, we're not seeing many Muslim women are going into that. How come that's not a problem?
We're also not encouraging so many Muslim men either. I mean, these days the trend is, and it has been for a long time, particularly in second generation in the UK, I'm not talking about other countries, but here, the tendency to encourage our sons and brothers to become doctors and lawyers. And there is almost, when someone does wish to become a scholar or pursue Islamic knowledge, it's almost seen as a sort of, oh, okay, sort of a slight disappointment, but there is some kind of otherworldly compensation that you keep in mind. When in fact it should be valued and celebrated much more.
Absolutely, there's a particular need for women, because just as scholars, you know, there's a shortage of scholars who understand our lives as British citizens today. There's a real shortage of people who understand our lives as women in Britain in the 21st century, because you know, as a woman, you're going to have a unique perspective, and I think it illustrates that we are across the board wasting the talents and the contribution of half of our community a lot of the time. You know, just look at the number of mosques where women are not even allowed over the threshold, despite the fact we all agree that's un-Islamic.
Sure, but what if the attitude is, or that mosques, for example, certain mosques may say, well, women have a different role to play in society. They're not supposed to be going out and farming or, you know, climbing mountains with us. Similarly, you know, men come out and pray in mosques. Women, they have a different role. They've got their family makers, and they pray at home with the children.
I mean, I think Islam is very clear in giving suggestions as to the different roles that men and women have. However, the mosque in particular is something where it's very clear that women are supposed to have equal access to these spaces.
Sure.
In terms of roles generally, which I think your question points to, the thing with the Islamic system is that it does give clear guidance and it plays to your strengths. So it understands the man and his strengths, the strengths that he tends to have. Not all men are the same.
Sure.
And it understands the strengths of the woman that she tends to have. That, again, they're not all the same. And it tries to make them work together so they're not both doing the same role. I mean, it's like, for example, if you and I decide, you know, we're going to build a car, but we both say we want equal rights to work on the wheels, and we both sat there and we made the wheels, and then we don't have a car at the end because we haven't divided up the work the way it should be. And I think Islam kind of tries to help us to organise that.
But how does feminism address this issue, though, in terms of roles and responsibilities?
I don't think it does. I think we can see sort of how feminism has made a bit of a mess of it for society here, to the sense that, you know, women now, they wanted to have the opportunity to do everything, but now they're actually having to do everything, to the point that, you know, maybe even many men are starting to think, well, maybe they don't need to really get a job, and they don't need to do this, and they don't need to do that, because a woman's going to take care of it. So I think it's majorly backfired, and I wouldn't want to see that happen for Muslim society, because we both, men and women, have rights and we have responsibilities to balance those out. So we have different privileges, we have different freedoms, but we're also equally accountable before God. So our equality, I think, is in we all have an equal shot at attaining his pleasure. But the methods are not all the same, but that doesn't mean that one of us has a harder time, is deliberately given a harder time to achieve that. So.
How do you see that, Catherine? 'Cause
I think too often in the Muslim community, women are pushed out of public life full stop. And that, I agree, we can have complementary roles to play. But certainly I find in an organisation like MPAC, where women are able to play our full roles in leadership, in management, in decision making. Actually, a lot of the time it's women who get more work done. And I'm sorry to my male colleagues, but that's, that's often true. And if we're just pushed to the back, as the mosque should be the active community centre at the heart of all of our communities, and it's a major issue that, despite the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Do not deny women their share in the mosques." We, as a community, are finding it acceptable that there are not one, not two,
many,
hundreds of mosques in this country that won't even let a woman pray her compulsory prayers to God in that space. And yes, we have the right to pray in the home, but Islam has that balance, and the fact that we don't stick up for Islamic rights is the problem. Islam does not oppress women, and that is the stereotype, but there's plenty of Muslim men that do, and there's plenty of Muslim societies and communities that do.
Zara, I'm sure you've spoken to many people, feminists and Muslim women, who are perhaps going through issues that they feel is coming from Islam, that Islam in some way or another prescribes a male-dominated narrative. What type of ideas exist out there that people feel problematic about Islam?
I think most of them, if not all of them, are actually based on misconceptions, and it takes a very brief discussion to actually explain that, Islam is not trying to do this to you. And oftentimes, as Catherine was saying, most of the time it's not Islam, it's the lack of Islam, it's the absence of Islam. And in terms of problems that women actually face, most of them are not from religion, they're from the problems that everyone faces in society. And in terms of sort of what women want, if you look at the Pew research done, it was published in April 2013, so it's very recent. The overwhelming majority of men and women, there was hardly any discrepancy in gender in a number of Muslim countries, all said that they wanted to see more Sharia law, and that was including in family law and property law matters. So it's not a matter that they see Islam as the problem. In fact, most of the time they see it as the solution. So it's actually very rare to come across a Muslim who says, I think Islam is oppressing me. It's often that,
Absolutely. I think the example of the hijab is classic. MPAC in our media work has time and time again had to go on the mainstream media and explain that, no, as a Muslim woman, I choose to wear this because it empowers me to go out and play a full and active role in public life, and to have my contribution judged on what I have to say, what my opinions are, what I do, and not what I look like. But we're not seeing women empowered and encouraged to take on within our community organisations. There are greater exceptions, those rules. One of my favourite stories, from the time of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is at the time of Ummah, when he was Caliph, he held a meeting in the mosque, and he said that he was going to cap the marriage payments that were made to women. And a woman in the mosque...
The dowry.
The dowry, yes, absolutely. She stood up and said, the maha, that is our right from God. And, this is wrong. You can't take this away.
Yep.
And Ummah, peace with him, said, the woman is right and I'm wrong. And that kind of accountability and that kind of contribution of a woman who helped to correct the course of the Islamic community.
Sure.
How often, how many mosques could that scene happen in now?
Yeah, very.
Just to sort of
story
comment on
there,
that, if that's all right. I mean, I think we understand that there are problems for men and women, but I think my real concern is that the only solution to this is Islam and not feminism. Feminism is actually...
But before you go into Islam as a solution, do you think that there are, I mean, you mentioned earlier, feminism fighting for the rights of women. You said Islam is also defends the rights of women. Isn't there compatibility?
No, because feminism does a lot more than that. And what it ends up doing, as we've seen here in the UK, is it ends up giving gender privilege to women at the expense of men. But let me explain that. So Islam balances the rights of men and women, so it's a holistic view. It doesn't just look at one group of people and exclude the other. And that's really the only way to deal with human beings who live together. Women don't live in isolation, as they know from the problems that they themselves complain of, that they apparently come from men. And so Islam tries to bring them into harmony. Feminism, on the other hand, as I said, it only focuses on one group of society to the exclusion of others. In the UK, for example, this sort of focus on women has even led them, for example, to come up with the idea that women's prisons should be closed down, not men's prisons. Women's prisons should be closed down because women have certain conditions and certain life experiences that mean that basically their crimes are more forgivable. And I think in Islam we have a clear concept of justice. If you're a man or a woman, it's irrelevant. Whatever you've done, you receive either the reward or the punishment for it. But it seems to me that feminism is always striving to make excuses for women, but always ready to pin the blame on men. And because of this injustice, I don't think it is compatible with Islam, and I don't even think it's a question of compatibility. I think it's a question that because Islam is more holistic, feminism is completely redundant in the face of it.
Okay, well, we're going to have to come back after the little break, and inshallah we will readdress some of these issues with our audience straight after the break. Stay tuned with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Islam in Focus. If you have just joined us, we were discussing feminism in Islam. Joining us for the second half of the show, we will have Brother Iqbal Nasim, who is the head of the National Zakat Foundation. Brother Iqbal, assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us. Coming to with a question straight to you. Examples from the life of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from which we can learn how our attitudes should be towards women as our mothers, our sisters, and our daughters. What can we learn from this seerah?
Sure. Okay. Jazakallah khair. So, there's so many ahadith which point towards the importance of treating women, respectfully and properly. And if you just look at all the various sort of roles that you've touched upon there in terms of the mothers, we know that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in a hadith, when he was asked, "Man ahaqqu bi husni suhbati," that who is the most deserving of my good companionship, he said 3 times, your mother, your mother, your mother, and then your father. And we know that he said that Jannah, paradise, lies under the feet of the mother. We know that the reward for a man bringing up 2 or 3 or more daughters, properly and with kindness and with love, and with a good Islamic ethos, the reward for such a person is Jannah. We know that Islam obviously abolished the practice of the evil treatment of daughters and the burying of them alive. And with the wives, we know that the Prophet ﷺ said that the best of you is the one who is best to his wife. So, just from these ahadith, it is very clear that for those sort of key sort of relationships with one's mother, one's wife, one's daughter, that there is so much reward, so much emphasis, so much importance given to the kind treatment of women.
How do we see the results of this now Islamic almost coming and changing the course of attitude towards women in Jahili society? What did it produce? What kind of examples do we have from Islamic history of empowered women, women who became role models, women who led communities perhaps? Women played great roles in our history.
Again, we see that the opinions of women in public life were really respected and valued, and they were given that role and that consultation in decision making. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was an example of that in one of the most difficult political social junctures in his prophethood, when they had been blocked from performing the Hajj, and his followers did not want to accept that, and he was in a very difficult situation. He went to his wife for advice, and his wife's advice was, you shave your head and the Muslims will follow. And he took that advice, and that advice was what solved that situation. We saw women, they understood that they had that duty to contribute to society just as men did. When it was defending the Muslim community against attack, they went to the battlefield, they carried water, they treated the wounded. There were women who fought to defend Islam. So, they had that full understanding that this was their society, they were empowered within it, and mashallah, that was revolutionary. Do
you want to add to that, Zara, in terms of great women? I know you mentioned Sheikh Akram Nadwi's work earlier in terms of great muhaddithat in the Islamic history. Maybe any near history closer to us where you find great exemplary Muslim women?
Well, first of all, we don't even have to look at great scholars or great leaders. The four greatest women that we are told about were Asiya, Maryam, Khadija, and Fatima, radiallahu anhunna, and they were exceptional and extraordinary in their own right. And it wasn't because Khadija radiallahu anha was a businesswoman, it was because she was a believer. It wasn't because Asiya radiallahu anha was the wife of someone powerful and rich, it was because she believed, even though her husband, the Pharaoh, punished her severely for it. And the same for the other two great women also. And the contrast of that is are the wives of Noah and Lot, alayhim salam, who despite being married to prophets still did not believe, and they were ruined. And so there is an emphasis that we often forget of the true value of Muslims, including Muslim women, which is the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not necessarily that you do extraordinary things or that you sacrifice so much. It's more the fact that you obey the commandments of Allah, you believe in Him, and without exception, without compromise.
So how about today? And let me come to you, Iqbal. National Zakat Foundation, you guys do a lot of work with helping and looking after the welfare of women. How do you feel the practice of Islam is today? These great practices and these great examples of the product of an Islamic Muslim generation and their role and responsibility, and how what they achieved within an Islamic era. What's happening today? Do you feel Islam is practiced in a similar way that is liberating and empowering to women?
That's a very broad question, of course. I think, from our perspective at the National Zakat Foundation, obviously we work daily with, we focus on, if you like, the vulnerable, the destitute, those relatively impoverished sort of sections of the community within the UK. That's what we're about. We're about delivering a full Zakat service within the UK. So as part of that work, and a significant part of that work, we end up dealing with, women, mostly women, and most of our applicants and beneficiaries are women, our Muslim sisters, who have suffered sometimes very horrific levels of abuse, of deprivation, of poverty, of destitution. And that may or may not have been as a result of, a breakup within the household. But overall, certainly not, I don't want to be someone who's going to necessarily paint a picture or stereotype, for the entire community as a result of what we see on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is that we see a lot that would imply or suggest that certainly in some pockets of the community, there's a serious, lack of understanding and frankly of basic respect and dignity that is afforded to Muslim women. So here we're not even necessarily talking about the issues of really anything controversial, because obviously some of the topics we've talked about or the words that we've been using in some people's minds is straight away kind of invoke kind of controversial issues and about what roles women should or should not be playing. Here we're just talking about absolute minimum basic human rights, frankly, dignity, decency. I'll give you an example of the kind of thing that we deal with. I mean, this morning, for example, on the way to work, we got a call from a policewoman at one of the big sort of police stations in London, who was came to us almost as for what she felt as a last resort with regards to a Muslim woman that she had come across, had been a victim of domestic violence, had been given an Islamic divorce by her husband, had been kind of abused and what have you, and she had turned to their local authority for help, other charities, refuges, etc., but was finding all the doors closing, even from local authorities, because of the legal status of this woman. And she was coming to us to say, look, can you, National Zakat Foundation, do anything to support this particular woman? And then she shared the details of the case. And when you look at the case, anyone who's looking at that case would find actually, this is really shocking kind of details, but that's the kind of stuff that we come across every day, that someone's been thrown out, left abandoned, she had £3 to her name, literally, and frankly, all this person had was a clothes on her back.
So there's ill treatment of women, and I think nobody denies that it exists in all sections of society, within Muslim community and outside of the Muslim community. But what about, Catherine, I mean, maybe that women have taken a back seat these days and they're not really getting out there and doing things for themselves as perhaps they did historically, some of the examples you mentioned earlier.
I think that there's a problem that, young Muslim women are not being educated about the rights that Islam gives them. And therefore, and I think there's also a problem that our community, we're very good, very, very quick to defend Islam against the charge that it oppresses women, and I will absolutely do that, but we are very slow to stand up for those same rights that we love talking about and try to implement them in our community, and to fight against these kind of problems in a practical way. This is on a low priority, and I think any issue of social justice seems to get pushed aside. As long as we've got the rituals, as long as we've got, we can spend money building shiny mosques with nice chandeliers, then are we spending the money to create these shelters and justice for women? Are our scholars only debating about what colour a woman's hijab should be, or are they teaching the brothers and sisters about the rights that Islam gives them? So, I mean, MPAC, we have run very active campaigns for women's rights in the mosque, not only to be able to enter and to pray, but to have our say and role in decision making. And we've had a lot of backlash from people who said, you're creating trouble, you're washing our dirty linen in public. And these people who agree, oh yes, Islam gives women their rights in the mosque. I say, well, what are you doing to implement that? If you don't like the way that we're doing it, if you don't like the fact that we're saying loudly and publicly, giving out leaflets outside the mosque, doing petitions, then how are we going to change things and make that Islam that gives women their rights and gives the oppressed generally in society their rights a living reality?
Okay. You mentioned something earlier, this particular case, which is very real, legal status of woman who was married, the nikah thing. And we find that case quite prominent across the UK and maybe around the world too, where in a non-Muslim society, the legal status or marriage, or nikah marriage, is not recognized, and that can lend itself to being abused. How do we deal with something like that, Zara?
Well, I think that question kind of ties in with the end of what you were saying. The reality is that these rights were thriving and they were a living reality up until very recently. The Islamic rights were ordained and protected. For example, the latest time that we saw them was under the Ottoman Caliphate, which was only kind of rescinded in 1924. So it's a very recent period of time in which we have no longer had these rights.
Yep.
And actually, if you look at the very early feminist literature, even though they were written during the time when women did have these rights, and women in the Muslim world had actually better status than women in the West, despite that early feminists wrote about Muslim women as if they were oppressed and men were the oppressors. And then this narrative, I'm just going to finish, this narrative was then borrowed by sort of colonial powers to enforce this ideology amongst in Muslim countries as a way of dividing and weakening Muslim society. And so we're at this point now where the media is also using this language, and it has done for a long time, is using this language of feminism, of saying that you women are oppressed. Yes, there are problems, but I'm just talking about generally the narrative that is used to kind of to put a focus on this as a way of demeaning and discrediting Islam itself. And problems such as the nikah not being recognized, problems such as, you know, women not being allowed in mosques, all these problems, they didn't exist during, for example, under an Islamic state, because the state was there to enforce any deviations or any weaknesses amongst men, because men and women are, after all, human beings, and they can't be relied upon to be perfect. So you need a system that enforces these rights in the absence of human beings doing so themselves.
We can't idealise the past, and the state is not perfect and infallible.
But it's not the past. I mean, this is actually a very recent history, and it's something that a lot of Muslims are striving to re-establish.
I can understand your point in terms of Islamically, it's not sanctioned, these practices or malpractices within the Muslim community or community at large, but Catherine's point perhaps is that the reality of the matter today is that we have these ill practices. How do we deal with them?
Well, we can deal with them in a very symptomatic way. And I think, for example, the work that I think another guest who was going to be with us today, the Amira Foundation, and your organisation do excellent and very necessary work, without which a lot of the women who face these problems right now probably wouldn't be able to survive. However, in the long term, we can't rely on just putting a Band-Aid on these problems, which are much deeper. You can't say that, you know, this problem is a one-off thing and that if you just fix this one, the rest will be okay. It's an existing problem and it runs deep, and therefore the solution has to run deep. We can't treat it in a very surface and superficial way. It's not going to last.
Iqbal deals with it all the time, I'm sure. How do we deal with these problems, and what works?
I think Sister Zara makes a valid point in the sense that, you know, we don't sort of pretend that, you know, our solution is the solution. Certainly at the moment, the vast majority of our work is cure as opposed to prevention. But that's just because the disease is so big that it just makes sense to sort of start curing it before you just almost start to prevent it. I mean, if the house is on fire, you put the fire out before you start fireproofing the house again. And that's what we're dealing with now. So I think the issue of the various kind of abuses and mistreatments of women that we do see in certain pockets of the community where they are kind of rife within the community. You know, there's a lot of education clearly to be done. Maybe there's just an extent. Some of it, hopefully, inshallah, will be solved by just a passage of time, with hopefully a generational shift and all sorts. To an extent, obviously, that's not going to be the only thing. But there's a lot of that educational things to be done. I mean, our concern is this: is that if it is the case that a woman in this country, you know, is experiencing poverty, destitution, desperation, that we should, at least as a community, have an infrastructure to be able to deal with that. Because up until...
I think more recently, with the existence of National Zakat Foundations and maybe other such organizations, I think the Muslim community are privileged in a way to have organizations like that they can turn to for practical solutions in addressing existing current problems. But what about, you know, really addressing these issues more from an Islamic educational perspective?
I absolutely agree that long term, you know, it's great that we've got emergency humanitarian solutions, but education, and that means really changing the way that we understand the priorities that Islam gives us in practicing things. We're very focused on the external, you know, how long is that brother's beard, you know, you know, how the fine details of the fiqh of prayer and arguing over those. When there are human beings who are suffering, there were women who are being mistreated, there is injustice, there is oppression. And we have to fundamentally understand that Islam was a revolutionary force that brought justice, that fought against oppression, and that gave us as Muslims a duty and obligation to stand up. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, if you see a wrong, then change it with your hand, and if you cannot, then with your tongue, and if you cannot, then hate it with your faith, your heart, and that is the least of faith. So we have an obligation. It's not like we've done our prayers, we've done 5 pillars, tick. We can forget about the injustice to women, and we can forget about other injustice. We have to stand up for social justice as Muslims, as the centre of Islam.
Any final thoughts on this, of how do we really address women's concerns in the best possible ways, given all the background and all the challenges that we have? What's the best way to deal with this, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think just really to echo everything that's been said, I think I don't think anyone's going to disagree that clearly education and all these things are at the core of the solution here. But the problem is, I suppose, is that a lot of this stuff happens behind closed doors. A lot of the people who maybe are involved in, you know, kind of various abuses, mistreatments and whatnot, you know, they're not necessarily the easiest people to access in terms of kind of conveying a message.
So they don't have to suffer in silence at the moment.
Well, exactly. So this is the thing. Well, see, that's the thing. So in terms of victims, what we see is, you see amongst victims, what we experience is that, you know, there's a huge amount of tolerance, if you like, for, you know, for abuse, frankly. I mean, they say that in the kind of, I think mainstream statistics show that, you know, a woman may wait, you know, 6 or 7 times, you know, before or experience something like 6 or 7 times before she actually decides to take a step and report it. And I think in some of the subcultures and communities within the Muslim community, that number's probably double or triple, you know, before someone will actually report something, or, you know, actually decide, you know what, I've had enough of this, or if it is an abuse.
Providing that widespread support structure they can come to within the community.
We're coming to the end of our discussion. Maybe 20 seconds, Zara. Final thoughts?
Yeah, just final thoughts. Education is important. However, it's not a panacea. It's not the only thing. It's not going to get us the whole way. Some of the most corrupt and cunning people in history were highly educated. So it's not just education that's going to save the day, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Jazakumullah khair for joining us. We're coming to the end of the show this evening, and I'd like to thank Sister Zara Faris, Catherine Heseltine, and Brother Iqbal Nasim for joining us on Islam in Focus. In today's episode of Islam in Focus, we've analysed the situation of women in the 21st century and the confusion of a woman's role in society. We've highlighted the flaws inherent within feminism, and that the rights of women are successful, and ill-treatment of women, how that to be avoided in the light of Islam and the teachings of Islam. When analysing history, we see that mistreatment of women has always been a concern across the globe. In this way, feminism is nothing new, but rather a reactionary ideology which sets men as the yardstick by which women's successes are measured, creating an unnecessary competition and conflict. Our religion, Islam, teaches us that women and men are different and have complementary roles and responsibilities in family and society. Men and women are partners and not competitors, protectors of one another, not in a fight against each other. However, Muslims may have deviated from the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, and we must do more to revive the teachings which restore, emancipate, liberate and empower women to be who Allah has created them to be. We hope today's episode has been an insight into the problems faced by our Muslim sisters globally, and the role that education and investment within the societies can play in improving the lives of our beloved sisters. Throughout our endeavors, we should always strive to seek to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to have to conclude the session here today. You may follow this discussion online or on Twitter. With these words, we'll have to conclude. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.